Hi class, let's talk about diseases of the nervous system. This chapter is broken up into three main portions. The first portion is focusing on the normal defense, or the defenses of our nervous system. Portion 2 is going to focus on the normal microbiota of the nervous system. And then the third portion, and biggest portion that makes up a little bit over half of the chapter, is going to focus on diseases of the nervous system. So to get started, let's focus on our first portion, the defenses of our nervous system. Our nervous system, it can be broken up into two big parts. The central nervous system, which is the brain and spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system, which is everything outside of the brain and spinal cord, which will be our nerves and our ganglia, and any sense organs. These components have very important functions. There are sensory functions, integrative, and motor functions. We need to take information in, so we need to collect information with our sensory organs. That information is then going to be sent to the central nervous system. Within the central nervous system, we integrate the information that we have come in, we process it, and generate some kind of a response, and we send that response to the muscles and glands of our bodies to enact some kind of action or effector organ. The neurons within our nervous system are the cell type that most people like to focus on. The neurons are kind of the rock star of the nervous system. They have very dense structures that are associated with these neurons, networks of dendrites and axons that are branching off the neurons will form those dense structures. And neurons make up a large portion of both the brain and our spinal cords. If we look at our brain, it's situated inside of a helmet, so to speak. This helmet is the skull, and our spinal cord is also going to be embedded in bone. It's going to be embedded within the vertebral column. The bones that surround our spinal cord that make up the vertebral column are known as vertebrae. The soft tissue within these bony structures are going to be encased with three protective membranes that are known as meninges. We have the dura mater, the arachnoid mater, and the pia mater from outside to inside. Our dura mater is the tough outermost layer. And I've got to share this anecdote because I think it's hilarious. In German, Dura Mater means tough mother. I always get a kick out of that. The subarachnoid space, which is deep to the arachnoid mater, but superficial to the pia mater, is going to be filled with CSF, cerebral spinal fluid. And this is kind of like a cushion that helps protect those soft structures of our central nervous system. In addition to acting as a liquid cushion for the central nervous system, the cerebral spinal fluid also circulates around the tissues of the central nervous system to provide nutrition. Microorganisms can be found in the cerebral spinal fluid during meningitis, when the meninges of the central nervous system become inflamed, but generally speaking, we're not going to find a lot of microorganisms within the central nervous system, within that cerebral spinal fluid. If we look at the peripheral nervous system, we'll have both the cranial and spinal nerves. And as we look at the structure of the nerves, we can see that the nerve is a bundle of axons. Recall, an axon is that extension of a neuron that carries the action potential away from the neuron. And these axons are bundled together and will communicate with each other across little tiny gaps called synapses. To communicate across these little tiny gaps, the neurons within the nerves use a chemical known as a neurotransmitter. This is a chemical that will transmit the electrical impulse across the tiny gap, across that synapse, and start the electrical impulse or action potential on the next cell. Here we can see an overview of the nervous system. We have the brain and spinal cord making up the central nervous system, and then a bunch of nerves and sensory receptors that make up the peripheral nervous system. Our nervous system defenses are going to be mainly structural. So we have those bony casings, we have the cerebral spinal fluid, we also have the blood-brain barrier. This is a special vascular interface, or interface between the cardiovascular system and the cerebral spinal fluid. We don't actually have blood go directly to the brain tissue itself. Instead, the blood will transmit its nutrients to the cerebral spinal fluid, and then the cerebral spinal fluid will then transmit the nutrients to the nervous tissue. The cells that make up the blood vessels in the brain have special connections in them that make them very, very impervious to leaks. It makes it very difficult for something to leak out of the bloodstream into the cerebral spinal fluid. And the special connections in between the cells of the blood vessels only allow for a few select tiny molecules to pass through. Most microorganisms and antibiotics, and I should also emphasize leukocytes for that matter, are not able to enter the cerebral spinal fluid and the central nervous system because of that blood-brain barrier. So because of this, we say that the central nervous system is immunocologically privileged. It's only able to mount partial or different immune responses compared to the rest of the body. One of the reasons for that is because of how important the CNS function is. If our CNS, or central nervous system, was compromised, even by a temporary bout of inflammation or the temporary normal immune response, that could be very detrimental or damaging to us as a human. So instead, we're going to have an alternative immune system in our central nervous system. It's going to be made up of microglia and brain macrophages. These are two cell types that both have phagocytotic capabilities, and they're very comparable to the general generic phagocytotically active cells that are present in the rest of our body. Here we can see a close-up of the brain, and here on the brain we have wrapped around it the meninges, and then within that space we have the cushion of the cerebral spinal fluid, and around it we have that hard, bony casing of the skull and the vertebral column. So, concept check class. Which of the following defenses of the nervous system prevents certain molecules from passing into the brain and spinal cord tissue? Is it A, the bony casing of the skull, B, the microglia, C, cerebrospinal fluid, D, blood-brain barrier, E, brain macrophages? You can rewind this video, flip back in your notes, or check the textbook to get an answer. Go ahead and pause the video and get me the answer. 5, 4, 3, 2. The correct answer is D, blood-brain barrier. The blood-brain barrier prevents contaminants from getting into the cerebral, or into the brain and spinal cord tissue. If you have any questions, please feel free to post them on the discussion board or shoot me an email. Happy studies.